Good evening, everybody. It is my absolute delight to welcome you all to this final Magic and Ecology panel. This is our final live panel on ancient magic and the non-human world. We're here doing magic and ecology this evening. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our two speakers this evening. So first, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. David Abram, who is a cultural ecologist, philosopher, and sleight of hand magician. His influential work, The Spell of the Sensuous, Language and Perception in a More Than Human World, demonstrated the parallels between animism and eco-phenomenology and brought non-Western ontologies into dialogue with Western metaphysics. Abram is especially interested in language and has done important work on the ethics of speech and how it relates to the environment of things named. Abram holds a PhD from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and is founder and creative director of the Alliance for Wild Ethics. It also gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. Merlin Sheldrake, who is a biologist and the author of Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. He received a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in the tropical forests in Panama, where he was a pre-doctoral research fellow of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. Merlin is a keen brewer and fermenter as well, and is fascinated by the relationships that arise between humans and more than human organisms. So hopefully you have all had the opportunity to listen to both Merlin and David's wonderful conversation on YouTube. And now are brimming with questions, which I am so keen for you to send to us in the chat to get us going. But I think the first thing that I would like to do is welcome you both and kind of situate us gently in this talk by saying that the talk we saw from you both on YouTube, your wonderful conversation, implies a very long-standing relationship. And I wanted to ask perhaps a bit of a cheats question first. What is it that you find, both of you, that you have discovered in one another's work that has enlightened your own practice or influenced your own thought? So David, if I might hand to you first.
In Merlin's work and person, I find an elfin playfulness, mischievous imagination, audacious and really brilliant creativity that tugs at the edges of established categories and tickles them to transform and shapeshift into something other.
What a beautiful and poetic response. And Merlin, if I can hand to you.
I think there's a lot that I've absorbed from David's work that I don't know that I've absorbed, because when I was very small, with me and my brother would sit rapt with attention as coins appeared and disappeared before us in all sorts of strange ways. And actually, I don't even remember that as many times that happened, but that had to be told to me. So I think there's a whole lot that has just gone in sub-threshold and lives there to this day. But the stuff that I'm conscious of is concerns, I think, the importance of perception in understanding everything that we understand, and also the fluid dynamic relationships between humans and modern humans, and holding the focus steady on these webs of relation, because in a way that helps us to understand more what it is to be a human. And these are just a couple of examples. There are many more.
These are both wonderful examples, and I am so glad that we are already touching on the ecological web of connection that brings you both together and that brings your work into such relation. I will say to our audience, please do feel free to enter your questions into the chat. Imagine that this is the end of a conference panel, having seen the conversation between our two speakers. I will also say that we are all in our strange places. For some of us, it is the middle of the night. For others, it is a strange health day. And for me, I have a strange throat. So we are all talking through the murk, as it were. So my next question is to press a little on something that you two talked about during the first section of your talk together. Now, David, your history as a sleight of hand magician was touched on, and the ways in which magic were discussed in your conversation touched very much on kind of, I think, two major forms of magic. So on the one hand, sleight of hand, magic that relies on illusion, and what we might think of the magic that stage magicians might do. And on the other hand, there were conversations about early magicians and their inquiries into the natural sciences, which have now been sort of reified into the formalized systems of science. And I wanted to push you both a little because I felt there was an energy here that skirted around perhaps magic in a third space, magic as it is practiced, with perhaps illusion and with perhaps a nod to science, but magic as we have seen it touched on in this series as a living, breathing, Western and non-Western practice of alternative worship or of practical achievement through metaphysical means, or of connection with the world, the more than human world, in a way that is extraordinarily potent beyond either illusion or naming. And I wanted to sort of push on that.
Well, one thing I'll toss in very briefly at the beginning is just to say I've never seen even my sleight of hand craft as a craft of illusion. I've never seen myself as an illusionist. I'm in a tiny handful of working sleight of hand magicians who actually believes in magic. Most do not, and they see themselves trying to create an illusion of magic. No, for me, dancing within this mysterious medium of perception itself is magic. And I don't see the work I do with coins, with objects, with stones, sometimes with small animals, but I don't see this as I don't see these as tricks, but as magics, or rather attempts at magics. Sleight of hand is a set of mudras, hand gestures that one practices to get one's repertoire of such mudras down so that one can coax the spirits close. And sometimes they descend or ascend up from the ground and take possession of the situation. And sometimes they don't. And the magic doesn't quite happen. But more often than not, if one is skilled, the magic begins to move. And it moves for me as much as it does for anybody in the audience or anyone watching. It's an astonishment and a strangeness. So I just needed to flag that I don't really have truck with the notion of illusion here.
This is enormously refreshing, and I am glad to hear it. Merlin.
I like very much something that David once said to me, which was, I asked him about magicians, and he said, well, a magician is someone who learns when not to use magic, because we're all using magic all the time. When we write, when we read, we forget that the power of a word written on a page, at these scrawled lines, can conjure in our minds whole scenes and vistas and feelings and more. And is this not magic? And likewise, in my mind, music is absolutely a magic, that you can create noises with your body or with other bodies that you bring close to yours, and with other people, and you can create entirely new phenomena that weren't there before, that have actual measurable action in the world, that can change things. And so, yeah, no, so I would never want to constrain the magical to the realms that you described to start with, and these areas that we covered at the beginning of our chat. But I also like to include, as we talked about a bit later, the placebo effect feels like a very powerful magic hiding in plain sight. The action of words and gestures, possibly from another, activating feelings in ourselves, which transform our bodies. And hypnosis is another powerful one, where something said to you can mean you put a pencil on your skin and you get a blister. You know, someone tells you that it's going to burn you, it burns you. These, I think, are very powerful magics, and again, that we use all the time. And so maybe you'd think about a magical practitioner as somebody who had got very good at focusing these magics for particular purposes.
Thank you. I think that opens up a huge amount, and I'm glad that you were both able to expound on that as it came up in the earlier conversation. And
yeah,
Simone,
I would say one more word, Alice, just up on what Merlin spoke of, this thing that I deeply hold, which is that a magician, by which I mean not just a sleight of hand magician, but a person who has become adept at the craft. A magician is one who knows how not to do magic, because, as I think Isabel Stangers stressed in your interview with her, our world is saturated with magic, and much of it very unfortunate and kind of bad magic that is steadily deadening the vitality of the things around us, and dreaming the world in such a way as to choke it steadily, and to choke up wetlands and dam up rivers and deaden the life within those rivers and streams. The whole advertising industry that inundates us endlessly, and that we've come to take utterly for granted, torquing our intentions and our yearnings. So the craft of magic also then is learning how not to indulge in this very potent, powerful craft, except when it's really called for. And so refraining from doing overmuch manipulation and exerting one's will on the world, except when it's really, when the world itself is calling for some such mischief.
Yes, and I think that's a lovely way of understanding it. There is something about being able to stand outside those powerful streams of magic extant, which is in itself a form of powerful action, I think, through quietness and inaction and attention. So Simone, in her inimitable precision, drills down further into this. She writes in the questions that some in our audiences are scholars and others practitioners, some are both. I would love to hear your thoughts on dancing with magic in work that would often be seen in opposition to it. Merlin, I might hand that to you first.
I guess it depends on one's perspective. Academic work might seem to some to be in opposition to magic. I don't find it so. I find it just as filled with ways to ways to generate feelings between entities, between a reader and an author, for example, or in someone's imagination, just like any act of writing does. I like this idea that our senses participate in the world they perceive. We have to actively engage with any of our perceptions. They don't just enter us as if we were some passive receptacle, but that we rise to meet that which we perceive, and together in that kind of melding, that's where the perception lives. And so even in a very dry academic conference, for example, filled with stuffy technicalities and barbarous jargon, one might expect to find still these participatory perceptions and those who work with those. So I think there's all the more reason to use magic in areas maybe which are traditionally thought of as magicless or even antithetical to magic. And like David said, I think that a lot of people are using magics without calling it magics. The advertising industry is one, but I think also a lot of those who fight very hard against anything that could be perceived of as magical and use magic as in pejorative sense, as in magical thinking, to dismiss that which falls outside the rigid margins of their worldview. I think even they, in their magic-free zone, will be using magics. So I don't think it's so easy to delineate these different areas.
Mm. Mm. Yes, I think I would echo that and say that magic is what the world is made of. And a great deal of what we take to be counter to magic, that is reason, logic, and keen rationality and rational analysis. It has seemed to me, and this was really a theme of my first book, The Spell of the Sensuous, that modern reason is itself sustained by an intensely animistic engagement with our own signs. That book unfurls a thesis regarding the influence of writing and the way different forms of writing take up and transform our animistic participation with the world, where we start participating with our own written symbols, the written characters themselves, but with the alphabet in particular, we enter into a kind of deeply animistic rapport and sort of a closed loop with our own alphabetic symbols that reflect the human face back to itself. So I see the letter D and I go duh, and I see the letter F and I go up. That is the written letters as I participate with them reflect me back to my own face, and the human sensorium begins to be closed within itself in this kind of self-reflexive loop that gives rise to, this is the birth of modern reason and rationality, that it's born of an intensely concentrated form of animism or participation mystique, but with our own written symbols, such that we could really say that reason itself is a very concentrated form of magic. And so the idea that one is, by engaging other, older, or more expansive forms of magic, one is working counter to rationality. It seems to me, is kind of a goof, because our whole mindset and everything we call Western civilization, I think, would better be spoken of as alphabetized civilization, a civilization that has been forged through this very concentrated form of magic, participation with our own signs. So
that is lovely. I'm really grateful to you both for those very full answers. I've been reading Norse myths to my partner's children, and the myth of Heimdall calling out the young Carl in the forest for knowing the runes and using them for nothing but singing to birds came up last night. It makes me very much think of that, the civilizatory, if you like, responsibilities the alphabet brings are a major concern of the Norse stories, I think. And it's a lovely parallel.
Of course, it's not by chance that the word spell has that double meaning. I think we spoke of that in our first early interview, but just the meaning of arranging the letters to spell a word or to cast a spell, because originally those two meanings were not so different, not so separate. To learn to read and write with the alphabet is to cast a kind of powerful spell upon the world, but also upon one's own senses.
Yeah, it is the absolute learning to read is an absolute act of hypnosis, I think. So we're going to pivot, such is the joy of audience questions. We're going to pivot through Michael's questions. So thank you, Michael. Michael writes, in a little under an hour, I'll be getting my second vaccine shot. I wonder whether you could talk about our ongoing entanglement with the COVID virus and more generally with those more than human entities which we humans may perceive and experience as dangerous, destructive or frightening, which seems a very prescient question, particularly for you, David, at the moment. Either of you may start, whichever one. Merlin, perhaps, if you have fungal relations in this department.
Well, it strikes me that we always need to think about these entities as being in relation to other entities, and only then can we assess the degree to which they are frightening or pose a threat or pose some life-giving benefit. And indeed, many cases, there are entities, some bacteria in your gut, for example, that play a crucial role while in your gut. You couldn't live without them, but should they get into your bloodstream, they'll kill you. So are these good or bad? Well, it depends on not just the relationship to which organism they have, because it's you in both cases, but in exactly what way they are in relationship to you, and that can change. So there's a lot of, I think the narrative is usually constructed as, and it's actually a hangover from the early days of the germ theory of disease, when disease was reimagined as, reconceptualized as something caused by invading outsiders. And of course, it often is caused by invading outsiders, but as is becoming increasingly clear, it's just as often caused by imbalances within our own bodies that are not due to some entity which has come in from outside, but for other reasons. So so this narrative of the invading outsider, and you find that a lot with all the discussion now in the current pandemic, and I think it glosses over many of the ways that viruses are entering our bodies all the time and live in our bodies, and actually live in our genomes. So the genomes are filled with fossilized viruses that once started from outside and have now ended up inside us, and which we dutifully replicate every time we divide one of our cells. And indeed, some of our greatest, most distinctive traits have come from viral infections, like placental mammals arose because of an inherited, a retroviral infection, which inserts into our genomes the ability to override the immune system of another, which allows young developing mammals to develop within their mothers without being rejected as another. So in this case, you can think of this invading outsider as endowing us with our ability to have our most profound intimacy as the kind of organism that we are. So just so many ways to think about it. I would always bring it back to what relationship is this organism in, and how dynamic is that relationship?
Mm.
Thank you.
I think another aspect is that it seems to me, perhaps one of the deepest senses of or meanings of the word magic, and the most primordial ancestral sense of magic is simply the experience of knowing oneself, feeling oneself to be alive inside a world that is itself alive through and through, where there are so many other shapes of sentience, intelligence, sensitivity out and about, so very different from one's own. And all of them, all of these other lives entangling with ours and with one another's to compose this, outrageous breathing biosphere in which we find ourselves bodily immersed and embedded. That to me is the uttermost experience of magic. But people think, oh, wow, so that's an experience of deep wonder. Yes. And so that must be delightful. And they envision or feel toward this, thinking of it as a kind of blissful sense of gosh, goodness. No, it's terrifying. In fact, it's a sense of being a part of a world that is massively dangerous, where many things out and about are bigger than us and can eat us, and other things way smaller than us can also infiltrate our organisms and take us down. But in the modern world, and also in many elements of the more ancient traditions, one response to this sense of pervasive vitality and life in many other shapes is to armor oneself and shield oneself, and to give so much energy all the time to try to protect one's organism from takeover, or from being subjected to the wildness that surrounds and the dangerous otherness all around us. But it seems that's a never-ending and process that leads one to live a life without very much flavor of wonder. One is always sort of armoring oneself and living in a kind of paranoid state. Another approach that I take to be deeply magical is one of opening one's boundaries, taking care that the boundaries of oneself, also of one's community, never harden into barriers that shut out the more than human world, but that they stay porous, like one's skin, that they stay a membrane, these boundaries, across which there's a two-way flow. And you allow some things in, some things for sure, you let them bounce off you, but others you allow in even when you don't really know what their quality or texture is, because you know that they can pass right through you and out the other side. And so rendering oneself more open to the flows that are always flowing through the world and through us all the time. And that's a less hair tearing out, feverish attempt at endlessly protecting oneself. Yeah, if that makes some sense.
Absolutely. And I think that this idea of what may pass through us and what may lodge in us, to better or worse, is brought back whenever something particular is highlighted. But whenever one virus is highlighted, I always think of all the ones that we don't know about, or that we are not attending to currently, that are just living and doing their thing around us, which brings
and
us...
also, can I just add, also to all of the other deadly small entities like small particulate matter generated by air polluting vehicles or industry that kill very many more people than this pandemic has, and which get a fraction of the attention. And so just the many ways that the subvisible realm can kill, and the many ways you can apportion agency to humans and non-humans within that.
Yes, absolutely. And on that note, we have a really lovely question which takes us and organisms in a different direction. Merlin, I suspect this is more for you, but David, I'd love you to chime in if you have input. It's from Cara, who asks, I'd love to hear more about the practical connection between the fermenting process and magic.
I think there are a lot. Let's see, what are some ways that I think about that? One is in transformation. So fermentation is transformation. It's domesticated decomposition and or rehoused rot, and any process of transformation, I think, rides closely with the magical, and so another way is in the sensory experience that fermentation provides, the way that it allows our sense of taste and smell into processes of chemical transformation that might normally live quite outside the realm of our taste and smell. I like fermenting things because it gives me a little window into the big cycles, the big biogeochemical cycles in which we live, and allows me to taste these transformations with my own mouth and thus participate with my own body in these sensations, but also in these vast communities of subvisible organisms undergoing these remarkable processes. So that's another way. And then another way would be the way that fermentation nourishes us as a food, and the ways that that nourishment of us can allow us to move forward into continued becoming as living beings in this living world.
Thank you. I am a recent convert to the eponymous lockdown sourdough starter. The gift, the intimate living gift that lives in one's fridge. So I feel very delighted to hear this. David, have you any fermentative thoughts?
No, I do feel like my whole brain is fermenting at the moment because I just received the second vaccination a couple days ago, and it's wreaked a kind of havoc upon my organism. But for those of you who haven't read Merlin's book, Entangled Life, there's a wonderful story he tells in there, fermenting some apples that he gathers from the original tree that, or that may or may not be the original tree that Newton was sitting beneath when an apple fell on his head or fell nearby. And it's just a wonderful story. And so I highly recommend people dig in there.
What I will try to do as we go through is link to your work and websites where people can, if they haven't read your books, then purchase them and learn more. So that's a lovely, thank you, David. That's a very elegant plug, elegant Apple-based plug. So we have two questions, which I think mesh into one, from Liz and Nikki, which both push for you have both really elegantly described magic as being sort of particulate and ever present in the very fabric of being. And both question askers would like perhaps a little drilling down. Nikki, I will phrase Nikki's question. Oh, sorry, not it's from Andrea via Nikki on YouTube. Do you distinguish between the terms magic and witchcraft? And if so, how? And Liz's question is, I feel a need for a bit of definition of magic, please. This is the Magic and Ecology series, so we are always chasing people this way, I think. So I will offer that to the two of you to respond from fermentation to definition. Would either of you like to take that on?
Would you start, Merlin?
So with regard to the magic and the witchcraft, I would say that witchcraft, which strikes me, would be just as well described as maybe witchcrafts, because there are so many ways and have been so many ways to practice these arts, that they are magical processes, but that one could practice magic without practicing witchcraft. That would be my first thought. The witchcraft is a particular a set of traditions of magic, but they do not fully encompass the magical. But there are other ways of doing magic in other ways. And with regard to definitions, yeah, good question. I don't have I'm afraid I don't have a good answer, which is why I haven't given any kind of crisp definition of magic throughout this entire discussion or our entire discussion beforehand. And these have felt to me very much like an exploration of what it is that we think of when we hear this word magic, what it is that we think magic might mean, and the different ways that magic might arise in our lives. So I don't have a neat definition. It feels like if I had a neat definition, then I would have almost certainly missed something substantial. So I wouldn't want to slip into that heffalump trap. But all I can say is that, yeah, that this whole conversation has felt to me like an exploration of what it is that we mean by magic. At least when David and I are talking, what it is that the two of us mean by magic.
Yeah, I think the idea of defining something like magic is bound to get one in trouble. It is the undefinable. To the extent that it's a quality without a name, really. I did hazard one possible sense of it before by saying that magic is an experience. It's the experience of feeling oneself alive within a world that is itself alive through and through in a gazillion other shapes than one's own, which is just one participant in this vast dynamism, this vast field of entangled life. Another is just my sense that all of the great religious traditions of the world, the large world religions, have at their core a mystical tradition. Kabbalah within the Jewish tradition, Sufism within the Muslim world, the Islamic world. But it seems to me that at the core or at the heart of each of the mystical traditions, one finds the magical tradition, which is, one would say, I might say, the mysticism of this world, of the body's world, which is the earth, the mysticism of the relation between the body and the breathing earth. So in the magical tradition, which I'm suggesting is at the core of each of the mystical traditions, one finds a body of practices that are often very, very practical and pragmatic practices involving how to generate heat within your body when all around you the cold is coming on, how to douse for water in times of drought, all sorts of very pragmatic, practical skills or practices that take practice. But these skills and the magic tradition, it seems to me, they're at the heart of the mystical traditions. The magical traditions, in this sense, are holdovers from the pre-religious, indigenous ways of life that flourished in that realm, in that region, before these other more transcendent religious traditions took hold. And so that's one way of framing it, very different from anything I've seen out and about by other scholars of magic, but that's my sense.
Thank you both very much. And I think that, Merlin, were you going to?
Sorry, Alice, I wonder, given your perspective and your role in organizing this conference, what you come to think of as magic by this point?
Well, this is very interesting because I work from a kind of environmental perception perspective academically, but I am fascinated by both you and David's use of magician, because magicians in the craft perspective from which I come represent those medieval and earlier practitioners of what we would call high ritual or written magic. So next to alchemists, magician is a form of learned magical practice, informed often by precisely what David says, the mystical which lies at the heart of the religious. One thinks of the Seal of Solomon, one thinks of the Abramelin texts. Witchcraft, however, or witchcrafts, Merlin, which I enjoyed, the aggregate forms of intuitive and preservatory acts, which are so often tied for us contemporaneously with the bringing back of handcrafts, folk traditions, all of which have to be celebrated but also treated cautiously as they regard certain political affiliations. But for me, I am always loath to in any way suggest gender essentialism in these definitions, but for me, witchcraft is something that comes often orally, historically, that is to do with the hedgeways and byways of hard-learned healing, of knowing where does not freeze, of knowing where the birds go in cold weather, of knowing when a woman who is bearing a child looks as if she will not make it, of knowing which cows are doing what and why. And magician is a very different tradition. It's not that these two cannot be melded, especially in contemporary society. But when we talk about magic, so when I teach the history and theory of witchcraft, we talk a lot about what the body does because of what we have learned. So the idea that an intuitive practice must come of an informed one, but the level of that information may be something as practical as what is poisonous and what is not, which brings us back to fungi rather beautifully. But that the theory, although it is fascinating, is secondary to the marshalling of the act. And that some of the best magics that any of us can do are around listening and necessity, as David says, when the world calls, if we can answer. When there is a sick person, can we offer comfort? When there is a lover, can we offer full attention? When the world is our place, can we hold it with all of our body and self? And for me, that is very separate to the grids in sand and the raising of spirits that fall from the magician's tradition. Although they are aiming for the same thing, I just happen to find witchcraft to be a much more satisfying way of getting there.
Ah, that's wonderful. Wonderful, Ellen. If I might bounce off of what you say, because I do sense magic to be more an umbrella term, witchcraft as a particular form of magic. But I would say also that the magician, if one focuses in on the personage, although it's not just in the human species that one finds magicians, I'm convinced one finds them in many other species, if not all other species. The magicians are the intermediaries, those who practice bridging from one's own species to other species, to other plant species, for instance, those who know the ways of the poisons, as you speak of, but how to also work those poisons as medicines. Which herbs are good for healing which ailments, but intermediaries with the other animal cultures. And so it seems to me this is, again, what I'm steeped in is the indigenous magical traditions from a number of different tribal traditions around the world. But also feeling into the animistic indigenous origins of the Jewish tradition, which is my own. I find this matter of the intermediary, the one who tends the boundary between worlds. But most concretely, those worlds are the worlds of one's own species, needing to bridge, come into contact with, even communicate well with another shape of awareness or intelligence. So I wanted to speak of that. And of course, it has much to do, something common in what Merlin has said, what you've said, Alice, and what I've said is, it has a great deal to do with immanence.
Yes, completely.
A sort of contrast to the trajectory toward transcendence, rather a sense of bringing the sacred and the holy down into the material world, into the body, into the rock and the stone and the lichen. Yeah.
And I wish to before we move back to the beautiful, rich questions that our audience have given us, I wanted to just mention there's a wonderful British traditional term, hedge riding, which is exactly that. It is the moment of liminal slip at the boundary point. The hedge witch contend beyond is everything else, behind is where we are, and those who are chosen to ride the hedge, to straddle both, is, and I've always thought that was a wonderful term, because when one tours around the English countryside, as I have been today, one sees very neat little hedges, which are not the ones implied, but I always think of witches straddling privet hedges in the most kind of wonderfully disruptive way. So I thought
it's interesting. Sorry.
No, please.
It's fascinating you say that. Just makes me think, because hedges, ecologically speaking, are a kind of domesticated forest edge, where when we make a clearing on the forest, and the edges where you have a lot of the species that need light to produce the fruit or the flowers that humans need from them. So when humans settled and created these more stable agricultural environments, hedges were a way to create edge, crossing point.
Yeah.
So I like that term a lot.
And also ways to bring a kind of microcosmic wildness right in the midst of our super domesticated fields. Hedges always seem to me to be wildly unruly when I get stuck in one and peer into it and see all the critters going about their lives. But isn't that the hedge rider also the origin of that common word for witch, the hag? Doesn't that come from Hagazusa, which means she who straddles or rides the hedge, she who rides the hedge?
There's also the Anglo-Saxon Hegtessa, which speaks into that as well, which is lovely. It's one of the various origins are fascinating of the hag and the hedge. So we will turn from the hedge back to the chat, and so there is a question here for David, which David, I may require your help parsing it a little. So Lawrence Davis asks, arguably the ecotopian or eco-utopian tradition has been and remains a powerful and playful force for challenging and changing our perceptions of our relationship to the more than human world. Do you perceive resonances or affinity between your own work on the ecology of magic and the ecotopian tradition? And if so, perhaps could you elaborate on particular influences? So I'm hoping that eco-utopian is something that perhaps you could expand on in its definition for all of us here also.
Oh, well, I'm not entirely sure just what Lawrence is referring to there, except a particular movement in the northwestern United States and Western Canada. There was also a wonderful book called Ecotopia that I think that was the title of the book, was the author Ernest Kallenbach or something like that, but spoke of of that whole region of North America seceding from the United States, perhaps also from Canada, and declaring itself its own nation. And in that sense, Ecotopia and that ecotopian vision has tremendous amount in common with what we might speak of as the bioregional vision, which is the political vision that calls us to, as my work, as I suspect all our work calls us to, become ever more local, become ever more bodily, and for me at least, inviting folks to really identify not first and foremost with your particular gender, with your particular ethnicity, with the color of your skin, but identifying yourself as an animal among animals. And so becoming ever more bodily. But to become body is also to become ever more local, attuned to the nuances of your particular place. What is the sort of politics that goes hand in hand with the magic vision, it seems to me, is a bioregional politics that proclaims, affirms one's solidarity with all the other persons, but also all the other animals and plants that live in this region where I dwell, here in the upper Rio Grande Valley. And so peering underneath the straight line boundaries on the map, the straight lines and right angles that we impose upon the land, to see what are the actual borders and boundaries in the earthly geography here, in the earthly terrain, which have to do often with mountain ridges. And on the other side of the ridge, they live in a different watershed. They share water with a different set of animals who dwell there or migrate through, because the soils are often different in each of these regions. As we each know, each part of the earth, each place, is so exquisitely different from every other place. Here in the Southern Rockies, things are so different in flavor and texture and feel from the Amazon basin. And both are so different from the Hudson River estuary, where New York resides. Each of these almost is its own state of mind, its own style of awareness. Each place, its own, we could say, its own organ within the larger body or flesh of the breathing earth. And yet each organ depends upon the flourishing, not just of itself, but of these other organs, of these other regions, whose cultures would need to be very different from the culture of our region, because the ecology in the Amazon basin is so outrageously different from the ecology here. And so this kind of a vision of a re-diversification of culture, civilization beginning to break down and receive or respond and meet the invitation of gravity to settle back into place and evolve modalities of story and culture that are unique to one's own terrain and one's own place. That's a vision, I think, that is utterly consonant with the matter of magic and certainly with all of my work, calling us to the body and the body's rapport and reciprocity with the local earth, who is so different in each region. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Merlin, I wonder if that speaks a little to the ways in which you have encountered, I suppose a term would be perhaps fungal differentiation in your work in environments so different to our own.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you have a different bioregion, you're going to have a very different microbial flora. Just on one's body, we create these different regions. You have the arid plains of your forearm and the tropical forests of your crotch and the temperate forests of your scalp. And within these different bioregions of the body, entirely different populations of organisms live. There's a wonderful poem by Auden which discusses this. And so, yeah, one of the things with fungi is that you can't really deal with or understand what's going on unless you think about where this fungus happens to be living. Embedded in what is this fungus? You know, entangled with whom is this fungus? Because they just behave in such different ways depending on where they are. And it's often it's called context dependency, usually something like that, or along those lines within the ecological sciences. So yes, so a strong, I think studying microbes and fungi can like studying plants or anything in its lived environment, as opposed to dried specimens in a herbarium or a fungarium, for example, can lead one into a deeper appreciation of place and the particularities and special character of place. And one of the most exciting things about the soil, and there are many exciting things about the soil, but the soil is an incredibly diverse place. Well, there's so many places within even just a small patch of soil. You have different charged particles aggregating into different kinds of form, surrounded by water films behaving in different ways, different microbial communities on the outside of an aggregate to the inside. You might have different rates of respiration in this bit and that bit. Like it's a totally heterogeneous place, filled with places with character.
And cultures.
And cultures, yeah, cultures, exactly, literally cultures. And on that, it just, when David was speaking, I think back to that definition of magic question. And I think the way that I've been using magic most broadly is as arts of connection. And this is the way that I've been talking about it, the arts of connection with many different types of entity. And I wouldn't want to restrain it. And that's why I like this magic and ecology theme, because the ecology is about relationship, and relationship entails connection. And so I think these two subjects come together in my mind very nicely for those reasons.
We are so pleased by how people from all practitioner, academic, hybrid backgrounds during this series of events have found those two to be natural bedfellows, because we have really felt that they are, and it has been such a pleasure to see that thought through and thought with. So as we move to more thinking with, we have a question from Geeta R, and she asks a sort of more Mortonish question, I think. Do you believe that objects, non-human beings, the environment, can exert a magical effect, either good or bad, on us? If yes, does one engage with these things to get good magic? How to engage in a magical way in our everyday life?
I just found it in the chat, Simon.
Yes, so it's a slightly it puts me in mind of Timothy Morton and object-oriented ontology, I think. Although it's a question that could go in many directions. Merlin, do you have a thought about this in relation to networks of connectivity?
I suppose that it makes me think about the ways that our own bodies involve fluids and substances that we might, in a modern scientific tradition, think of as inanimate, like water or air. And all the chemicals that make up our bones being a kind of domesticated mineral, like the shells of tortoises and the tusks of narwhals. But the relationship between the inanimate and the animate in these cases seems less distinct, because the animate is brought into, is animated by the bodily system that it finds itself within. So then it makes me think about the ways that we include outside our bodies inanimate or inanimate objects like rocks, which are, or the rocks seem to have, they always get chosen. I take that back. I don't want to fall into that pattern of using rocks as a type case of inanimate material. But yeah, so that's what it makes me think of. It makes me think of as a way that we include the animate within our daily practices, within our communities, within our cultures, and that those inanimate objects and materials and fluids are brought into to action and relationship in that sense, rather like the way that they are within our own body, where they play these really important parts. And another thing that comes to mind is that I think it depends within the realm of what's called the inanimate, or thought of as the inanimate, which I think is problematic, but I think we know what we mean. I think of different, the degree to which a system or something organizes itself is important to me. So when a crystal forms, there's a self-organizing that happens there. There's a morphology that is acquired through a process of growth. And I think that's a bit different from something like a chip of stone that a sculptor chisels off a statue. So back to the rock. There we go. It's hard to get onto it, but I think there's a different step for me between the self-organizing growth process and something has arisen through not a self-organizing growth process.
Mm-hmm. I think for myself, I just would abolish any hard and fast distinction between animate and inanimate matter. It seems to me that if I allow that everything is animate, that everything moves, then I start seeing the world much more deeply, much more richly. Everything is animate. It's just some things move a lot more slowly than other things, like the ground underfoot or like the walls of this house where I'm sitting, and yet they still move. They still have their dynamism. Just as, you know, it was just early in the last century, we began to realize that, gadzooks, the ground itself, that plate tectonics was real, that the continents actually had been shifting. So yeah, it's all animate, it seems to me, and yet that's not a way of saying it's all the same. It's a way of opening to the outrageous multiplicity of differences in the way things move. So if I engage a particular kind of stone or rock around here, there's lots of sandstone, I can then, if I don't think of it as something inert and inanimate, I can inquire, what is your style of life? What is your way of dancing into the present moment? And how is that different from this slab of granite, who has no doubt a very different style of agency, of a different way of affecting the space around it and the things around it, and even of affecting me when I lean back upon that granite slab. Other thoughts will percolate into my mind than would it, no doubt, if I was leaning against the sandstone boulder. So I think it's important to allow multiplicity, and the strict duality between that which is alive and that which is inert or inanimate hides multiplicity from our experience. It hides the rich differences and differentiation. But the question also touched on this matter of good magic and bad magic. And I think it's really useful to, again, drop away that duality in order to notice there are so many different styles, rhythms, and textures and tastes of magic. And just as Merlin was alluding earlier, or both of us, that it's particularly those powers or plants that are often most poisonous, or clearly operate as poisons, that can be used as medicines when taken in much smaller doses. So the good, the bad, it's, often when people hear, oh, you're a magician, they'll ask, oh, so white magician or black magician? And I find that really sad. There is a kind of, perhaps a sort of basic duality within the old and indigenous magic traditions that I find around the world. There is a sense of two different kinds of magic, but it derives from a sense that the human species, like many other species, has two especially very basic forms of body. So there's men's magic and there's women's magic. And in so many of the tribal cultures I've had the luck to linger among, there's a very keen sense that women's magic is, of course, much more powerful and potent in that women are actually able to engender and grow life within one's belly and give birth. Men have other rich gifts and skills, but don't have that outrageous magical power. And so there's a certain extra power that is accorded to and recognized in women's magic. And in the Western world, also as Christianity took hold, I have tracked how these two forms of magic then begin to fall out as black magic and as white magic. That is women's magic, which is more overtly bodily, sensuous, and familiar with the muck of the real, is taken as frightening, disturbing, dangerous, whereas the men's magic, more given to language, incantation, spells, is taken as more less terrifying. But so if somebody asks, oh, are you, or says to me, white magician or black magician? I might reply, well, that depends on whether you're interested in what works or not. I'm interested in also the powerful magic. And so I've learned a great deal from women's craft. And yet we now know, and as is arising within our culture all around, that there are many more than two forms of gender within our species, and clearly within many other species as well. And so that neat bifurcation is beginning to open and blossom into a much richer multiplicity.
I think what fascinates me when people ask whether you do good magic or bad magic, there is a fascination there with assumptions, as you said, about effectiveness. It's not good or bad unless it has worked, is it? So, I've always found that fascinating. And I'm interested by how we apply ethics over such a range of haptic participatory engagement in the more than human world, so much of which is neutral, because the world enacts on us as we enact on it always and constantly. And there is a question somewhere, a little bit hidden up the thread, which asks, here Ashley Ray's question, which I think moves from this really beautifully. As writers, Ashley Ray asks, with deep roots in the ecological and in entangled and beautiful relationships with the magical, can you please speak to how the act of writing is both a magical and an ecological act? How can we engage in magic making and ecology through our pens? And I feel like that is the really kind of natural move from this conversation. So David, I know you have a lot to say on this, and also Merlin, I'm sure you do too. So Merlin, shall we start with your voice, and then bring David's in?
Yes. So there's so much here, sorry, can you just? They just sent me so many directions at once. Can you just remind me the core of the question again?
Absolutely. Can you speak, please, to how the act of writing is both a magical and an ecological act?
Yeah. So, so in the sense that there are so many connections that are being envisaged when I'm writing, I'm thinking about who's reading, who will read this. And so there's an art of connection with my reader. And one of the greatest excitements I find in writing is not actually knowing who on earth your reader really, really will be. And there's that wonderful uncertainty there. And so that it casts this unpredictability into the writing process, because if I was sitting in a room talking to someone face to face, then I have a clear idea of who I am addressing, or at least I think I have a clear idea of who I'm addressing. There's obviously untold unknowns there. But within the act of writing, there is it's like the gyroscope's being set on a wonk by this uncertainty of who's actually going to be, who am I talking to? So that's one way in which I envisage the connected practices of writing with the audience, with the reader. And then, of course, there are all the ways that it brings together and connects within my own imagination and how it weaves together different parts of my my thinking and my dreaming and my understanding. And so I see writing as making a kind of a weave, like a kind of tapestry of different parts of my mind and my past, and all the parts of that are being informed by all the other minds and other pasts that I've been exposed to. So I see it as this very much a kind of a felting, a weaving, and bringing together, a gathering. And so I think there are so many other ways. There's the ways that the act of creating something on a page that can invite someone into an imaginative space that has the power to transform the way they feel. I love your idea, Alice, of the hypnosis, writing and learning to read and write as a hypnosis. And so in all of these ways that it is connective, and in all of these ways that I think of it as sort of weaving, it is also ecological, because well, at least in the way that I understand ecology, which is to do with the relationships and the dynamic relationships forming, reforming, deforming between beings and entities. So there are other ways that it's yeah, I scatter off in so many directions, but I'll stop there and hand over to David.
I have to say, Merlin's writing, as you folks are aware, if you've been delving in his book, it has this many layered sort of fractal richness, where in, you know, sort of the deeper in you go, the bigger it gets. So a sense of, one can find a place in writing that that is, without you fully being conscious of it, is working on many different layers at the same time. And because parts of your unconscious are involved, and the spirits, we might say, are also getting involved in the writing. For me, a key element of that is writing not as a disembodied mind, but trying to write with my body. And so I'm always tasting phrases on my tongue. I'm the world's slowest writer and the world's slowest reader. I can't really read much faster than I read aloud. So if I'm enjoying something, I tend to read it aloud to myself. But speaking phrases or your sentences aloud, tasting them on your tongue as you're writing, feeling them resonate through your body, or at least inwardly sensing the rhythm and rock and roll of your phrases. Let there be a rhythm that begins to carry you as you're writing. This is, for me, key to the deep magic of writing our language back into the more than human earth. I think the written word, as I was suggesting earlier, the alphabet, has a lot to answer for in terms of the ways it's enabled the human to, and the human mind to close in on itself and reflect in the absence of other animals, of plants, even out of relation with the storm clouds overhead, where we just are letting our words play off of other words, play off of the other words I wrote down yesterday. And I forget all these other dynamic dancing powers who inform my life, who inform all my experience. And so to bring my body and to keep my body at the heart of the craft of writing is a practice by which one stays open to the wider, more than human conversation always going on. That is not, of course, then just in words, but is a conversation unfolding in song and rhythm and birds speech and cricket rhythms and the play of sunlight and shadow and night and the moonlight filtering down, you know, through the skylight. So writing, taking care in such ways, for me, I write in service, not to the written word, but in service to the more than human earth, but in a sense then in service to language. And I think all of us writers are at least partly working in service to the language, trying to open and loosen the habitual stuck categories within our language that are keeping the culture from noticing what's really called for in this time. Finding the ways of opening that, yeah, to me involves noticing that even our verbal language is not just verbal, that it has rhythm, that it has tonality, and that even any word we use has its shape and its particular texture in one's mouth. That's writing in relation to other animals, in relation even to the plant world. So for me, these are some of the pieces of my practice. I try and write so that another animal walking past the door, if I'm sounding aloud, speaking aloud, the phrases I've just been writing, that animal will pick up something of the meaning of what's being, of what's intended from just the sound and the rhythm and the rock and roll of the language.
I think that something that you both achieve in your respective works, for me anyway, is a very difficult balance between what we might call the clear glass of language, so that which allows us to conjure images from each word as we see it, and attention to the text as a material object, as text itself, which is vital as far as I am concerned, especially in writing on nature, because when we reconceive of text as object, all other objects from outside the text are called back into relation, and it can function deictically. And I think for a long time, if we look to the origins of nature writing, the glass plate method was very was key, was forefront, as if one was on the shoulder of the writer taking a walk or looking at a sunset. But what I think you both do is upset that, just ever so slightly unsettle it, so that we can once again conceive of an object among other objects, the object in our hands, the lines of writing. So, which I think is wonderful. And I wanted to ask you both if you had any sort of poets or prose stylists or natural beings, actually, whose calls or speech or song brings you to that dual focus in your work.
Well, one thing I need to say that I meant to include in what I was just unfurling is just the sense that for me, unlike many writers, I think, I write in service to the spoken language. So I'm not writing to get people reading more and more. I'm writing to get people putting aside the books and stepping out into the more than human play. But I am also trying to tickle people's tongue awake so that phrases I've written slide off the page and enter into the way they speak, like the phrase, the more than human world, which I introduced.
You have done beautifully, it must be said.
Yeah. So writing, and I can't help but feel Merlin is also doing this, whether it's a conscious intent or not. We are writing in ways that that can begin to inform and shift by whatever tiny increments the way people speak with one another, and when they're out in the world or just at home talking to friends and family, to help us begin speaking as full-bodied animals rather than as disembodied minds, as full-bodied animals speaking to other full-bodied creatures. And so those listening to us have to slide down from their heads into the rest of their muscled organism to hear and understand what's being said. And I think Merlin's doing that also consummately.
And Merlin, I will say now, we are at 27 minutes past. So after you have answered, I am going to lead us into closing.
There are so many writers who have shaped my world and shaped the way I write. And there are also so many musicians who have done that. And I think I'll choose one to answer this question because we're running out of time. And not the same musician, but a musical form. And that musical form is the musical form of Irish reels and jigs and slip jigs. Irish dance music, traditional Irish dance music, which has with it a momentum that slides one forwards into the very edge of the present. And I find this when I'm playing, I'm playing Irish reels on the accordion, and it's very clear. It's like water skiing. If you stop you sink. You've got to keep moving. And I find this when speaking, and I find this when this is an effect that I'm often trying to create when I'm writing. It might be more stilted in the process, but the thing I'm trying to end up with is something momentum driven, that through its momentum, it acquires levity, that it can take off, rather like an airplane's wing as well. You know, it only gets lift when it's moving. So this idea of momentum is very important for me, and listening meditatively to these Irish musical forms really helps me to do that, and I've been a keen student of these musical forms for this reason.
As a keen traditional Scottish dancer and singer, I am in full agreement that there is no better way to learn rhythms of speech and life than through reels. So thank you. Which brings us alarmingly to our close. I feel that the energy of the audience and the energy between us could keep going a good long while, but I am going to facilitate the retreat back into sleep in the early morning for Merlin in Australia, and relief for David, and rest for my own voice. So I have a couple of closing remarks before we thank our speakers. So this was our final live question and answer. And so on behalf of the conveners, Simone Kotver, Hjördis Becker Lindenthal, and Sophie Lunn Rockcliffe, we would like to give a special thanks to the team at Crash, especially Nikki Davidovsky and Judith Wyke for their help in making this event possible. All of our content and recordings of live events can be viewed online on the Crash YouTube channel, and there is additional material about the project, including a virtual exhibition of art by Charlotte Rogers on the Magic and Ecology website, which is magicecology.crash.cam.ac.uk. So only remains for me to say thank you so much to our audience who've asked such beautiful questions. And thank you so much, Merlin. And thank you so much, David, for joining us in this final question and answer. Thank you and good night.
Thanks so much to all you beautiful animals listening in.
And thank you, Alice, for holding this so beautifully.